I'm Dane Rose, and this map is about trust. And I want to begin with the core principle or the core relationship involved in trust. This is a chair leg or a table leg. And this is the underlying environment. And the question is, should this table leg trust the floor? And what's the answer? Well, the obvious response is to examine what's going on. What's the floor made of? So the first thing we see is that this floor is composed of a pretty even pattern. So there's sections of floor, and then there's sections of hole, and then there's sections of floor, and then there's sections of hole. So then we go down to the next layer and we see, well, what's that made of? Well, right here, what we see is a pretty solid vertical block that's then going down on a pretty solid vertical block. That's then going down on a pretty solid vertical block. Now, if we put weight on this point right here, can we trust? And the obvious question is what? What can we trust? Well, can we trust that there will be some vertical support for this table leg? Well, if we understand that these are solid blocks of wood or solid blocks of concrete, we can say, okay, that's pretty safe. But in this particular design, if we say this is maybe 2 to 3 feet tall and 4 inches wide, what about in an earthquake? If you had some weight on here and you had an earthquake, could we trust that this pillar would hold the table leg? The obvious answer is how much of an earthquake? And what I'm getting to is the fact that trust is a relationship of integrity. Integrity with some very specific things. In this case, if we are trusting that the table is going to be supported by the floor, or trusting that our next step is going to be supported by the floor, we're trusting in a relationship as we're walking of stability. So we're moving, but we're trusting that the floor will be stable. We're trusting that the floor won't move this way, won't move this way, won't move this way, and won't move this way. It'll be stable. That's what we want from floors. Do we trust the floor? You have to look at the design. Now, when you look at the design of a floor, you will say that it is trustworthy up to a certain tolerance. If the house or the structure shakes more than a certain magnitude this way and this way, the floor will lose integrity. If it is jacked up and dropped beyond a certain amplitude, the floor will lose integrity. If 280 million tons per square inch is put on this section of floor, it will lose integrity. If fire is applied to a wooden floor beyond a certain temperature and the right conditions, it will lose integrity. And so what I'm getting at is that trust is a technical relationship that involves a chair leg, a human being, a rabbit, an eagle, making a calculation, consciously or unconsciously, about a set of assumptions. Will this person lie to me in this condition? And it's really important to add in those conditions, because you can have someone, for example, who will sexually behave in their small town and will not sexually behave in Vegas. Or they will sexually behave in the United States, but when they find themselves out in the wilderness with an indigenous tribe, they will not sexually behave. That they will tell the truth to the judge under the penalty of perjury, but will not tell the truth to their child under some other situations. And so with every single thing, what we're looking at is the composition of a structure, a thought, a belief, a habit, an item, the composition of the structure. And based on the composition of that structure, the types of stresses that structure can and will withstand, and the types of stresses that structure cannot and will not withstand. Now, when you understand that dynamic, you know what is trustworthy. And it's a complete formula. You have, in this case, table leg, plus floor, plus environment, plus goal equals T or UT. So when we know the composition of the table leg and how much weight is going to be on it, that defines that. When we know the floor and what it's composed of, that defines that. And when we know the environment, is it on fire? Is it shaking? When we know the environment and how that is defined, and when we know the goal. For example, it's a completely different relationship for a table leg to be removed from the table, put a 30-pound weight on it, and with that small point and a strong piece of hardwood to pound away at the floor. You may well be able to puncture the plywood. You'll certainly be able to annoy the neighbors. So it depends on the goal. Is the goal to put something on the table and have it stay there without breaking? Is the goal to eat off of a stable surface? Is the goal to balance as much weight as possible to see what the situation calls on? You know, how strong a table leg is? You know, you can get a 3-inch table leg that can take literally a ton of weight balanced on it, but the floor might not be able to hold a ton of weight per 3-inch region. You can have a steel tabletop leg that's circular, and it'll just punch right through the floor after maybe 3/4 of a ton. Or maybe it needs 1.5 tons. So you have every aspect has to be measured and understood, plus the goal, and that's when you can spit out a number that says this is a trustworthy floor for this table leg to do this thing with this amount of weight on it for this amount of time at this time. So now you have it's trustworthy, or this is not a trustworthy. Or you can say 60% of the time. meaning this would be fine until an earthquake comes. Every 2 or 3 years, an earthquake comes. So you're good, probably, statistically speaking, your odds are such and such. Then, of course, you have the black swan events that we don't take into account, and we don't take into account that we don't take them into account because they're just too big and too random. And so then we have those which, have a statistical probability field. So this generates trust or not trustworthy. And of course, as we look at the substrates of this pattern, we see that this one is pretty solidly placed. This one's balanced on these two, so it could slide off, but otherwise is pretty solid. This one's got an angle on it, so if you put too much weight on it, it's likely to break and fall into here. This one's only got support here, so if you put the table leg right at this point here, it would be fine. If you put too much weight right here, it would snap this connection, and it's weaker on this side. So all of these things are important to know in the dynamic of trust. So if you trust something that is not trustworthy, is it good or is it bad? Well, if you trust that someone isn't going to steal from you, and on the basis of that trust, you put $100,000 into their bank account that you need, and then they steal from you, and now you don't have access to that $100,000, then the consequence is whatever the consequences of having lost that $100,000. Maybe your daughter doesn't have their medical bill paid. Maybe one child doesn't get to go to college. Maybe you don't get to retire. And then because you didn't do that, because they didn't do that, there's a whole ripple effect out from there. And so that is the harm of believing that someone wouldn't steal your money, and they did. But what's the harm if they wouldn't have stolen your money, and they could have helped you in this major way if you had trusted them, but you didn't trust them? And so you didn't get all that benefit because you didn't trust them. Imagine carrying a table for 10 years because you couldn't trust the floor, but the floor was 99.9% trustworthy that entire 10-year period. You've carried a table because you couldn't trust. Or you put the table down, a valuable vase broke because the table, the floor wasn't solid. And so there's a cost to trusting something that's not trustworthy. There's a cost to not trusting something that is trustworthy. And there's a benefit to trusting something that is trustworthy. So the job of the person who's trusting is to see clearly what they are trusting and to make a calculation. For example, if you ask a stranger to hold your queue in the grocery store, they don't always do it. Sometimes you get back maybe 1%, 2%, 3%, 10% of the time, and someone's cut in and you've lost your place. But what if they do it? You can't be certain, so it's a calculated risk. What if you don't take your camera out into the car because you don't want anyone to see it and steal it and break into the car? Well, there's an X% chance in different neighborhoods that that'll occur. On the other hand, if you don't bring the camera and don't leave it in the car and it's not in the back seat, then when you have this great time, you're not going to move your bulky camera in and out of the car all the time, and so you don't get to take the great photo. So there's a cost with a lot of things either way. And, the same is true with a marriage. If you trust that your partner is going to be there for you and they're not, What's the cost of that trust? If you don't trust that they're going to be there and you don't get married, and so nobody is there because you didn't give them a chance to be there, what's the outcome of that? And it's an interesting thing to look at the psychology, when weighing the risks of something like this, because some people would rather be certain that nobody would show up for them, and so they won't have any friends and won't trust anyone. And nobody shows up for them, and they don't feel, as bad about that as they would feel if they did have 5 or 6 friends and nobody showed up for them. And so what's the pro and con in that situation? And the idea of being helpless and not helped by close people is, for some people, worse. And yet, statistically or on a technical basis, if you have 100 friends and 80 of them are not trustworthy, and you don't really know for sure until they show up or don't show up, then and 20 of them do, or 2 of them show up, is that better off? And how do you feel about that? If 98% of your friends flake out when you really need them, but because you had 100 friends and 98 flaked out, you had enough of a sampling where you could select the 2 friends out of that mix that would actually show up. And how do you feel about that? Does that seem worse because 98% of your friends failed? But you've got 2 that you wouldn't have known for sure because you couldn't have picked those 2 out of the 100, but there they are. And what if those friends are only trustworthy because one didn't have a job right now, and so they had time, but they wouldn't have shown up if the accident or something had happened 6 months earlier? So they're trustworthy at that moment in time for that thing in that way. And so the purpose of mapping out this terrain of trust, which is, it's a metaphor for every area of our life, is to help understand when it is advisable to trust someone when there are no absolute guarantees, and when it is advisable not to trust someone when there are no guarantees. And how one can be more trustworthy, understanding that we are each unique shapes, is by communicating exactly what we can and cannot do. I'm not going to come and pick you up at the airport at 2 a.m. I will bring you to the hospital at 2 a.m. if necessary. I'm not going to do this. I am going to do this. And so what I hope to illustrate with these things here is that there are no trustworthy people, and there are no untrustworthy people. There are people, regardless of their intention and makeup, that can be relied upon to do certain things the majority of the time, whether those things are positive things or negative things. A mafia boss might be trusted to shoot every third time someone makes an irritating mistake. A mafia boss might decide to kill off the person, because if that's somewhat random, every time anyone makes a mistake, they won't know for sure if they'll be shot, if they'll be one of the 1 in 3. So everyone will be terrified and take it as a life-threatening thing. But it'll give him time to train new recruits. Because if you kill off all of your people at each mistake, there might be no one left. So the idea of inducing fear as a motivational tool is pointless if everyone's dead. And so you have, a process that you can trust people to do the things they do unless a force equal or greater shifts the momentum. People tend to be in ruts. You can trust me to make a longer than average video based on the data. And that doesn't mean I'm a good or a bad person. It just means I'm likely to do that, all things being equal. In this case, I've got fatigue after a hard day's work, plus the desire for a bath, plus my wife waiting for me. So this video is statistically likely in that environment to be a little bit shorter than some of the others. So what the value of trust is success. When you successfully predict how something will behave, positively or negatively, that's not in your control. When you successfully predict how something or someone will behave, and as a result of that prediction are able to achieve what you want more competently, you can then create more intelligently. You can be more intelligent. Intelligent being the efficiency with which energy is turned into human well-being, human intelligence. And so you can create more efficiently, more abundantly, more successfully if you accurately predict how other things and people will behave. You are trusting the algorithm of that prediction with a certain weight. Hopefully you're aware that it's not 100%. Given the odds, there's a 80-90% chance that this person will behave like this. Because 80-90% of the time they do that. So because I'm sure they're not going to watch the child safely, I'm going to add a baby monitor and a beeper on them so that I can send them back to the baby when they're not watching them safely, or I'm going to hire another babysitter, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do this. So then my success rate goes up because I understand the people I'm dealing with. I want to emphasize that success is a joint effort. The benefit of a win-win relationship is that you can come back and do another one. You can have another interaction with someone. However, it's a combination with people. If someone will tell you the truth about what's going on for them and why, and what they do and why, then you can develop a model upon which to trust them. And similarly, if you can help someone else, say, no, you can't trust me here, but you can trust me here. You can see that the biggest enemy of success is blind distrust or blind trust. When somebody says, particularly someone who doesn't know me very well, I trust you completely, that is profound incompetence, unless they qualify it. If they say, I trust you completely to not want to hurt me, and given that I've only told you 20% of myself, you've got a 20% odds of using your intention not to hurt me to actually succeed at that, because I didn't tell you that I have a sore muscle over here, and so you may lean on that. And I didn't tell you that I'm an incest survivor, and so if you move too quickly sexually, I may be re-traumatized. So I didn't tell you any of that. I trust your intent. And I've told you that I like Star Wars. And I've told you that my favorite color is blue. So with a good intention, going out to the movies, if you trust the intention accurately, you could predict that I'm going to take you to a sci-fi movie. But what about the other side? What about if I hate sci-fi movies and you didn't ask about that, so I wouldn't take you to a sci-fi movie? And so you have this algorithm, and I think this goes into it enough to be able to extrapolate what is one of the single most important algorithms to understand fully, to be able to break apart and apply intelligently in different situations. Because there are times that even if you would fail 80% of the time, you should go out and do it, because the benefit of the win is so great and the cost of failing is minimal. Getting a car might be one of those examples, even in a bad neighborhood. You might have your car broken into 80% of the time, in a given year, but it's still worth having the car. You might be with an incredible partner who is absolutely going to damage your health in this way, but brings so much value in this other area that you don't have a better option. And so you're going to stay in that relationship. So there we are, a map on trust, and I hope it serves you well.